What if you disappeared into a dense forest and days later, people heard your own voice calling you back? This isn't a horror movie plot, an exaggerated urban legend, or a story made up to scare children around a campfire. This actually happened to a 7-year-old boy in a national park in the United States. He vanished among the trees in a matter of seconds, and when search and rescue teams finally started getting some sign of him 3 days later, what they heard was impossible, disturbing. And to this day, there is no satisfactory explanation that makes complete sense. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover could completely change how you view those peaceful walks in national parks, those seemingly safe trails, those moments when you let a child play among the trees just a few meters away while you prepare a picnic. We're talking about a phenomenon that happens more often than you might imagine, in places that millions of people visit annually, believing that the greatest danger might be encountering a bear or getting lost for a few hours before finding their way back. Bobby was 7 years old when he disappeared. 7 years old, that stage where children are curious but still small enough that you think you can keep an eye on them all the time. He was with his family in one of the most visited national parks in the United States, a place that looks like a postcard with its majestic forests, well-marked trails, and structured camping areas. It was a summer afternoon, a beautiful day, pleasant temperature, perfect visibility. Nothing suggested that this would be the day where everything would change forever, where a happy family on vacation would turn into a living nightmare that doesn't end even years later. What happened was too fast to prevent, too common to seem extraordinary at the time. Bobby was playing near the trail. His parents could see him. He wasn't doing anything dangerous or suspicious. And then, in literally a matter of seconds, that time it takes you to look away to grab something from your backpack or tie your shoelaces, he simply wasn't there anymore. He just vanished, as if the forest had opened up and swallowed him, closing again without leaving a trace, without leaving a sound, without leaving anything but silence where seconds before there had been a child. In the first moments, there's that natural denial. He must be right there behind those trees. He must have run a few meters chasing some animal or butterfly. You call his name, hoping to hear that childlike laughter that doesn't realize it caused concern, but the laughter doesn't come. His name echoes through the forest and returns empty. And it's in that moment, in those first minutes of growing panic, that you realize the forest is much larger, much denser, much more impenetrable than it seemed when you were just walking peacefully along the trail, appreciating its beauty. The search began immediately. Forest rangers were alerted. Other visitors began to help, and within hours a massive search and rescue operation was mobilized. Sniffer dogs, helicopters, dozens of volunteers scouring every inch of the area. But Bobby seemed to have simply vanished. There were no clear footprints to follow in the leaf and branch-covered ground. There were no pieces of clothing caught in bushes. There was no sign that he had ever been there. And as hours turned into days, as temperatures dropped during the nights and hope began to dwindle, the only thing the family had was the deafening silence of the forest that wouldn't return their son. But on the third day, something changed. Members of the search team, working in a particularly dense area several kilometers from where Bobby had disappeared, began to hear something that chilled the blood of everyone present. It was a child's voice, weak but distinctly childlike, coming from the depths of the forest. And the voice was calling a name. It wasn't calling for help. It wasn't screaming, for mommy or daddy. It was calling Bobby, Bobby, as if it was searching for someone, as if it was searching for itself. Have you ever had that moment where something so strange happens that your brain simply refuses to fully process it, where you know what your senses are telling you, but the information is so impossible that you're paralyzed trying to make sense of it? That's exactly what it was like. Trained search teams, people who had seen it all in years of rescue operations, stood motionless for precious seconds trying to comprehend what they were hearing. And then they ran towards the voice, calling back, hoping to finally find the lost boy. But when they reached the point where the sound seemed to be coming from, there was nothing. No child, no Bobby, no explanation, just dense forest and silence again. And then, minutes later, the voice began again, this time coming from a completely different direction, further away, deeper into the forest. Bobby! Bobby! Calling, always calling. The voice of the missing boy himself echoing among the trees, as if the forest were playing a cruel game whose rules no one understood, and it continued, for hours, for days. Multiple witnesses, including experienced forest rangers and professional rescue team members, heard that voice. Some swore it sounded exactly like Bobby, based on home video recordings the family had provided. Others said there was something wrong with the voice, something not entirely human in the way it echoed, the way it moved, the way it called that name repeatedly, without ever seeming to tire or panic. Before we delve deeper into this unsettling mystery, I need to ask you something that will make all the difference. If this topic resonates with you, if you're also intrigued by cases where nature seems to hide secrets that defy our understanding, leave a comment below about what has touched you the most so far. And look, if you've ever had a strange experience in national parks or forests, especially involving sounds you couldn't explain, or if you know someone who has gone through something similar, share it here. Because believe me, you're not alone, and each account that emerges in the comments helps build a larger picture of what may really be happening in these places. And you know what? Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content. Every comment, every like, every subscription shows that it's worthwhile to investigate these cases in depth, with the respect that the victims and their families deserve, and with the seriousness that real mysteries demand. So if you're feeling that chill down your spine, that need to understand what really happened to Bobby, leave a like on this video. It's your way of saying that stories like this need to be told, that cases like this cannot be forgotten or ignored. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, now is the perfect time. Click that subscribe button and activate the bell, because every week we explore mysterious disappearances in US national parks, cases that rarely receive the attention they deserve, patterns that authorities prefer not to discuss openly. You're not just a viewer here, you're part of this community of people who want answers, who don't accept simply filing cases away as accidents in nature, when there are elements that clearly don't fit that explanation. Now, with you by my side in this investigation, we're going to get to know who Bobby really was, understand his family, and discover exactly what led that 7-year-old boy and his parents to that national park on that fateful day. Because to understand the impossible mystery of the voice calling his own name, we first need to understand who the child behind this case was, a case that haunts investigators to this day. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because the boy who disappeared in that forest wasn't just another statistic, wasn't just a name in a police report, wasn't a character from a horror story. He was Robert James Weston, but everyone called him Bobby. And he was 7 years and 3 months old when he disappeared in August 1998 in Yosemite National Park, California. And understanding who Bobby was, what his personality was like, and why his family was there on that specific day is absolutely crucial to understanding both what happened and the impossible mystery that followed. Bobby was the only child of Tom and Linda Weston, a middle-class couple from Sacramento who worked hard year-round so they could take family vacations every summer. Tom was an accountant at a small firm. Linda was an elementary school teacher, and both deeply valued quality time with their son. They weren't the type of family that neglected Bobby or allowed him to do dangerous things unsupervised. On the contrary, they were present, caring parents who took parental responsibilities very seriously. And that fact makes what happened even more disturbing, because it wasn't a case of inadequate supervision or irresponsible decisions. It was simply the impossible speed with which a child can disappear, even when you think you're doing everything right. Bobby's personality, according to everyone who knew him, was that of a cheerful, curious, and obedient child. He wasn't the type to challenge authority or intentionally put himself in dangerous situations. He enjoyed drawing, especially animals, and had notebooks full of illustrations of bears, deer, and birds, all done with an impressive attention to detail for a 7-year-old. He was a good student, had a small but solid group of friends at school, and according to his teacher, was the type of child who always tried to do the right thing, who worried about following rules and not disappointing the adults around him. This characteristic is important because it contradicts later theories that he deliberately disobeyed instructions or purposefully strayed. The journey that took the Weston family to Yosemite that fateful August was an annual tradition they had maintained for 3 years. Every summer, Tom took 2 weeks of vacation, and they would take a road trip to a different national park. They had already visited Yellowstone, the Grand Canyon, and now it was Yosemite's turn, which Linda had researched extensively and was particularly excited to visit. She had bought trail guides suitable for families with young children and had carefully planned the itinerary to include short, easy hikes, camping areas close to facilities, nothing too adventurous or risky. Their mindset was to introduce Bobby to the beauty of nature in a safe and controlled way, creating positive memories and perhaps cultivating a love for environmental preservation. Bobby had some experience with nature, but it was limited and always supervised. On previous trips, he had walked on marked trails, always with his parents, always in areas with other visible tourists. He knew the basic rules. Stay on the trail, don't stray from his parents, don't touch unknown plants or animals, make noise if he encountered a large animal. Tom had even bought a small whistle that Bobby carried on a cord around his neck, with instructions to blow it 3 times if he became separated from them. These precautions show that the family took safety seriously, that they were not being careless or naive about potential dangers. The transformation of their dream vacation into a nightmare began on the 4th day of the trip. The first 3 days had been perfect, exactly what Linda had hoped for when she planned everything. They had hiked easy trails, seen spectacular waterfalls. Bobby had been enchanted by squirrels and had even spotted deer in the distance. He had already filled half of a new notebook with drawings of everything. He was seeing, and in the photos from those first days, you see an absolutely happy child, smiling with that toothless smile that 7-year-olds have, holding pine cones, posing in front of giant trees, wearing the new hiking hat that his parents had bought especially for the trip. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because to fully understand what happened to Bobby, we need to understand the place where he disappeared. And Yosemite National Park isn't just another pretty park. It's one of the most spectacular and simultaneously most dangerous natural environments in the United States. A place where breathtaking beauty coexists with dangers that most visitors never realize until it's too late. And when you start investigating the history of disappearances, in this specific park and in American national parks in general, what emerges is such a disturbing pattern that it raises questions about whether we truly understand the risks these environments present. Yosemite is located in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California and encompasses over 3,000 square kilometers of wilderness. To put that into perspective, it's larger than the entire state of Rhode Island. 95% of the park is designated as wilderness, meaning an area maintained in its natural state without significant human development. There are deep valleys, granite peaks rising to over 4,000 meters in altitude, spectacular waterfalls, dense forests of redwoods and pines, and vast stretches of territory where humans rarely tread. It's a place of surreal beauty, but it's also a place where nature operates according to its own rules, completely indifferent to human presence or survival. Yosemite's transformation from native territory to national park began in 1864, making it one of the first protected natural areas in the United States. Today it receives more than 4 million visitors annually, the vast majority of whom stay in developed areas of Yosemite Valley, which represents only 7% of the park's total area. But even these relatively developed areas are surrounded by wilderness that can be surprisingly impenetrable. And it is at this interface between tourist area and true wilderness that most disappearances occur. In that zone where people underestimate how quickly they can go from a safe trail to territory where getting lost is extremely easy and being found is extremely difficult. The specific terrain where Bobby disappeared was an area of mixed coniferous forest, dominated by ponderosa pines, white firs, and incense cedars. The density of vegetation in this area varies, but in many places it is so dense that visibility beyond a few meters is completely obstructed. The forest floor is covered by thick layers of dead leaves, fallen branches, and in some places a dense underbrush of shrubs and ferns. It's not that fairy tale forest with a clear floor where you can see clearly between the trees. It's real forest, chaotic, full of obstacles, where walking off established trails is physically exhausting and disorienting, even for experienced adults. The mindset of casual visitors entering places like Yosemite often doesn't match the reality of the dangers present. People see the beautiful photos, read that it's a national park with infrastructure, and assume a level of safety that simply doesn't exist once you leave developed areas. But the hidden truth is that American national parks are places where people disappear with alarming frequency and in circumstances that often defy easy explanation. And official statistics likely underestimate the problem because many disappearances are not adequately tracked or categorized. According to data compiled by the National Park Service, which is notoriously difficult to obtain completely and systematically, there are an average of 600 reported disappearances in American national parks every year. Most are resolved quickly, people who were lost for a few hours and were found confused but unharmed. But approximately 10 to 15% of these cases are not resolved quickly, and some are never resolved at all. People simply disappear, and even with extensive searches involving hundreds of professionals and volunteers, advanced technology, and massive resources, they are not found. Neither alive nor dead, nor any convincing evidence of what happened to them. The impact of these numbers becomes even more disturbing when you consider that children are disproportionately represented in these unsolved cases. And there are shared characteristics among many of these child disappearances that don't neatly fit conventional explanations of simply getting lost. Children being found at impossible distances from the point of disappearance, far beyond what they should be able to walk in the time available. Children being found in terrain that experienced adults would have difficulty traversing. Children disappearing in seconds from areas with good visibility. And in some cases, children reporting experiences during the time they were missing that are bizarre or impossible to reconcile with what we know about the area where they were. David Paulides, a former detective who dedicated years to documenting these cases in his series Missing 411, identified specific patterns that appear repeatedly. Disappearances happening near water sources or granite rock formations, people being found, when they are found, without shoes or with clothes missing without clear explanation. Weather conditions changing dramatically soon after disappearances, hindering searches. And curiously, sniffer dogs frequently being unable to detect a trail, even in conditions that should be ideal for tracking. Bobby's case would eventually present several of these elements, adding to the unsettling pattern that Paulides documented. The specific dangers of Yosemite that are well understood include rugged terrain where falls are possible, wildlife including black bears and occasionally mountain lions, sudden weather changes that can lead to hypothermia even in summer, and the extreme ease of disorientation once off-marked trails. The density of the forest means you can be just 20 meters from a trail and be completely invisible. To people walking on that trail, the sounds of the forest, wind through the trees, rushing water from streams, can completely mask human voices calling. And the uneven topography means that walking in a straight line is impossible. You constantly need to dodge obstacles, resulting in movement that is far less efficient than it appears on flat maps. But there are also dangers that are less understood, or at least less openly discussed by park authorities. There are areas where the natural magnetic field seems to affect compasses, where electronic devices malfunction, where people report strange sensations of disorientation that go beyond simply not knowing where they are geographically. There are stories passed down through generations of park rangers about specific areas of the park that are avoided whenever possible, where strange things happen frequently enough to create unofficial institutional caution. And there is the simple fact that 3,000 square kilometers of wilderness cannot be completely monitored or understood, that there are vast areas where humans rarely go, where what happens remains unknown. The journey of any young child lost in that environment would be terrifying and physically exhausting, even under the best circumstances. Bobby, at 7 years old, lacked any of the survival skills that could have helped. He didn't know how to find drinking water, how to create shelter, or how to effectively signal his location. He had that whistle on the lanyard around his neck, but in dense forest, whistle sounds don't travel as far as you might imagine. And lost young children often exhibit paradoxical behavior documented by search and rescue experts. Instead of staying put or actively seeking help, they often hide, sometimes even from search teams actively looking for them. Fear and confusion can lead a child to believe they are in trouble and need to hide, creating a situation where they are being searched for, but actively avoiding being found. Write this down. The park is alive if you realize that natural environments on the scale of Yosemite operate according to their own logic, which we don't adequately consider when we treat them as mere tourist destinations. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because we've reached the crucial moment. That point of no return, where a perfectly normal morning of family vacation turns into a nightmare that never truly ends. And when you reconstruct what happened minute by minute through the testimonies of Tom and Linda Weston, through official reports, through meticulous analysis of the scene, what emerges is both mundane and absolutely terrifying, because it shows how quickly, how easily, a child can simply disappear even when you think you're doing absolutely everything right. It was 9:43 a.m., a time that would be precisely recorded because Tom had looked at his watch just moments before disappearing, checking how long they had been on the trail and calculating when they should take a snack break. The family was approximately 2.5 kilometers into the trail, walking at a comfortable pace, making occasional stops for Bobby to observe things that caught his attention, take photos, and draw in his notebook. The morning had been absolutely perfect up to that point. Bobby was in a good mood, excited about everything he saw, constantly asking questions about the trees, the birds, and wondering if they would see bears in the distance. They had just passed a gentle bend in the trail where there was a small clearing to the left, an open area with a large fallen tree trunk forming a sort of natural bench. Linda suggested they take a quick break there, that it was a good place for Bobby to do some sketching while they got some water. The decision was completely reasonable, the kind of break families take hundreds of times on trails without any problem. They left the trail the few meters necessary to reach the fallen trunk, Bobby already taking his sketchbook out of the small backpack he was carrying, talking excitedly about a woodpecker drawing he had seen minutes before. The transformation from normalcy to horror began so subtly that no one noticed until it was too late. Bobby had sat on the log, opened his notebook, and then paused, looking at the line of trees on the opposite edge of the clearing. Linda was taking a water bottle out of her backpack. Tom was checking the map. Neither of them was looking directly at Bobby at that exact second. And then Bobby said something. His last words that his parents would hear, words that would be analyzed and reinterpreted 1,000 times in the days and years to come. "Mum, is anyone there?" Linda looked up immediately, following the direction Bobby was looking, but saw nothing in the trees but shadows and dense vegetation. "Where, darling?" she asked, taking the few steps toward him. But Bobby was already standing, still staring intently at that specific point in the trees, and there was something in his posture, something in his expression that Linda would later describe as if he were seeing someone he knew, not with fear, but with recognition. And then, before either parent could react or speak, Bobby began to walk toward the trees. Not running, not with apparent urgency, but with that kind of determined movement of a child going towards something specific. "Bobby, stop right there," Tom called immediately, dropping the map and starting to move towards his son. His tone was firm but not panicked. It was still just a father correcting his son who was starting to do something forbidden. Bobby paused for a fraction of a second. That pause a child makes when they hear their father call, but are torn between obeying and continuing to do what they want to do. And in that fraction of a second of hesitation, Tom was almost reaching him, only a few meters away. But then Bobby took 2 more quick steps and entered the line of trees, disappearing from sight. The impact of that moment, that transition from visible child to child no longer there, happened in literally 2 or 3 seconds. Tom ran the final meters to where Bobby had entered the trees, pushing aside branches, expecting to see his son just a meter or 2 ahead. But Bobby wasn't there. He wasn't a meter inside the trees, he wasn't 5 meters, he wasn't anywhere visible. It was as if he had simply evaporated the moment he crossed that line between clearing and forest. Tom immediately began shouting his name. "Bobby! Bobby! Come back here now!" with that paternal, commanding tone that expects immediate obedience. Linda had run to join Tom, and they were now a few meters into the woods, turning in circles, looking in, every direction shouting Bobby's name. The vegetation was denser than it had appeared from the clearing, with an underbrush of ferns and young shrubs creating visual obstacles in every direction. Visibility was reduced to just a few meters. But even so, Bobby had entered there only seconds before. He should be there, he should be able to hear them, he should respond. 7-year-olds can't move that fast or that quietly. But there was no sound of movement, no flash of his bright red t-shirt, nothing but silent forest. Tom and Linda's mindset in those first few minutes went through a progression any parent would recognize. First, there's irritation mixed with minor concern. Is Bobby playing hide and seek? Is he testing boundaries, being disobedient in a way that will require a serious talk later? "Bobby, that's not funny, come out now," Linda shouted, in that motherly tone that's trying to sound stern, but has a current of anxiety starting to creep in. They spent about 2 minutes in this phase pushing deeper into the woods, calling out, expecting that at any second, Bobby would jump out from behind a tree or run back to them embarrassed or laughing at the game. But children can't stay completely silent and still for long. And as seconds turned into minutes without any response, without any muffled laughter or rustling of the leaves, the minor concern became something far more urgent. Tom ran back to the clearing, thinking that perhaps Bobby had gone around and returned to where they had left the backpacks, but the clearing was empty. He climbed onto the fallen log, raising himself to get a better view, turning 360 degrees, scanning the surrounding forest for a flash of red, any movement, any sign. Nothing. Linda had gone deeper into the woods, still screaming Bobby's name, her voice beginning to break with genuine panic now. She had the extra whistle from her backpack and began to blow it. 3 short bursts, pause, 3 bursts again. The universal emergency signal. Her thought was that if Bobby had his whistle and heard hers, he would know to blow it back. But there was no response. The forest swallowed the sound of the whistle, and nothing returned but silence. It was approximately 5 minutes after Bobby had entered the trees that the full truth of the situation hit both parents with a force that almost paralyzed them. Their son had disappeared. He wasn't playing. He wasn't just out of sight temporarily. He wasn't going to reappear at any moment with an innocent explanation. He had vanished into the forest in a way that seemed impossible but was undeniably real. Linda began to scream his name in utter despair now, that sound that comes from the primal place of maternal terror, while Tom ran back to the main trail, searching for other hikers, for anyone who could help. The journey of those first few minutes of desperately searching for Tom and Linda is difficult to fully imagine unless you're a parent. Your brain oscillates between denial and utter panic. Part of you keeps insisting that this can't really be happening, that at any second the situation will resolve itself, that it's impossible for a child to have disappeared so completely so quickly. But another part is frantically calculating. How much time has passed? How far could he have gone? How long until nightfall? What are the dangers? And overlaying it all is that visceral fear, that terror, that something terrible has already happened or is happening at that very moment, while you're wasting precious time not knowing where to look. Tom found another couple on the trail approximately 10 minutes after the disappearance and managed, through a voice broken by panic, to explain the situation. The man immediately offered to run back to the start of the trail to alert forest rangers while his wife joined the search. More people appeared, drawn by the shouts and whistles, and within 20 minutes there were about 12 people scouring the area around that clearing, all shouting Bobby's name, all looking for the bright red t-shirt that should have been impossible to miss but remained invisible. Comment below. Seconds are eternal if you understand how quickly everything can change, how a few seconds of distraction can result in consequences that last forever. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because the first hours after Bobby's disappearance were a desperate race against time involving massive mobilization of resources, technology, and especially people who dropped everything to try to find a 7-year-old boy who had simply vanished into the forest. And when you understand the search and rescue protocols for children lost in wild environments, when you see behind the scenes of how these operations work, you realize that even with all the training, all the technology, all the determination in the world, the forest has advantages that are almost impossible to overcome when time is critical. Yosemite Park rangers were alerted at 10:14 a.m., exactly 31 minutes after Bobby disappeared. Ranger Kevin Morrison was the first to arrive at the scene at 10:38, and he immediately recognized the situation as critical. A 7-year-old child missing in dense forest, almost an hour having passed, ticked all the maximum emergency boxes. Morrison immediately activated the missing child response protocol, which is different and more urgent than for missing adults, because young children have far less survivability and far less time before hypothermia, dehydration, or other dangers become fatal. The transformation from an improvised search by volunteers into a coordinated search and rescue operation happened with impressive speed. Within 2 hours of the disappearance, there was a coordinated team of 43 people on site, including forest rangers, county search and rescue team, trained volunteers, and members of the Yosemite Search and Rescue Group, who are specialists in operations in that specific terrain. A helicopter was being prepared for an aerial sweep, and 2 teams of search dogs were on their way, estimated to arrive in 90 minutes. The immediate impact was establishing a perimeter and beginning a systematic search. The operational theory for missing 7-year-old children is that they can typically travel 3 to 5 kilometers from where they were last seen in the first few hours. This creates a potential search area of approximately 78 square kilometers, an area impossible to cover completely in a short time, but which can be prioritized based on topography, water resources, and the most likely direction of movement. Ranger Morrison established the clearing where Bobby disappeared as ground zero and began organizing teams into sectors radiating outward. But there were immediate challenges that complicated everything. The density of the forest in that specific area meant that even with 40 people, complete coverage was impossible. People could be 5 meters apart and not see each other through the vegetation. And that meant Bobby could be hiding, unconscious, or trapped somewhere that teams would pass meters away without detecting. The protocol is to have teams close enough together that their visibility zones overlap, but in such dense forest, this would require literally hundreds of people walking shoulder to shoulder, a resource that simply wasn't available in the critical first hours. The mindset of lost children adds another layer of complexity that makes searches more difficult than they seem to need to be. Experts in lost children's behavior have identified a pattern called the negative hiding response, where frightened children actively hide from people searching for them. This seems contradictory. Lost children should want to be found, but fear and confusion can cause them to see even rescue teams as threats. Bobby, if he was conscious and mobile, might have been hearing people calling his name and deliberately hiding or moving away, thinking he was in trouble for disobeying, or simply so frightened that his instinct was to make himself small and invisible. The search dogs arrived at 12:45 p.m., 3 hours after the disappearance. There were 2 teams, each with German shepherds specifically trained for search and rescue of missing persons. The dogs were taken to the clearing, allowed to sniff Bobby's backpack that had been left behind, and then released to track. What happened next was the first of several profoundly strange elements that would mark this case. The dogs couldn't establish a trail. Both dogs, working independently, circled the area, showed some initial interest in the direction where Bobby had entered the trees, but then completely lost the trail just a few meters into the woods. They seemed confused, circling repeatedly but unable to follow a consistent line. This was highly unusual. The conditions weren't ideal, but they weren't terrible for tracking either. It hadn't rained recently, there hadn't been strong winds that would disperse scent particles, and Bobby had only been there hours before. Under normal circumstances, trained dogs should be able to easily follow a child's scent. But both dogs, after about 45 minutes of trying, simply couldn't. Their handlers reported that it was as if the scent simply ended, as if Bobby had ceased to exist in terms of scent a few meters into the woods. This was alarming and completely inexplicable. The ground search continued with increasing intensity as the afternoon wore on. More volunteers arrived continuously, and by around 3 in the afternoon there were over 80 people actively searching. They were organized into teams of 4 to 5 people, each team receiving a specific sector to search, radios for communication, and instructions to look not only for Bobby alive but for any evidence. Pieces of clothing, belongings, signs of recent movement. Helicopters began aerial sweeps, flying in grid patterns over the area, using thermal cameras that should be able to detect the child's body heat, even under tree cover. But as hours passed without any sign, the desperation grew proportionally. Every member of the search team knew what no one wanted to verbalize: the chances of finding Bobby alive diminished dramatically with each passing hour. Young children have limited energy reserves, dehydrate quickly, and are extremely vulnerable to hypothermia. Even if Bobby were completely unharmed, just lost and frightened, he had at most about 48 to 72 hours before dehydration began to create serious health problems. And that assumed he hadn't been injured, hadn't encountered any of the many dangers of the forest, hadn't fallen into a stream or ravine. Tom and Linda were present throughout the entire search, refusing to leave even when rangers gently suggested they perhaps go somewhere to rest. How could they rest while their son was out there somewhere? Linda was physically trembling with adrenaline and panic, her voice already hoarse from shouting Bobby's name so many times. Tom was pale, moving like an automaton, joining each search team that went into the field, refusing to stop even when he was clearly exhausted. Both were trapped in that horrible state of suspension where you can't accept what's happening, but you also can't ignore the terrible reality of the situation. As the sun began to set and shadows lengthened across the forest, a new urgency entered the operation. Night in the Yosemite forest arrives quickly, especially under dense tree cover. Temperatures that had been a pleasant 22 degrees during the day would drop to possibly 8 degrees during the night. Bobby was wearing only a t-shirt and shorts, no jacket, nothing to keep him warm during the mountain night. If he were exposed to the elements, if he hadn't found some kind of shelter, hypothermia would become a serious risk within hours after sunset. The decision was made to continue searching through the night with rotating teams, something that is not standard because searching in dense forest in the dark is dangerous for the searchers themselves and generally ineffective. But nobody was willing to stop, not with a 7-year-old child out there somewhere. Lights were brought in, the most powerful available, and smaller teams of more experienced searchers continued scouring priority areas throughout the night. Base camp was established in the clearing where Bobby disappeared, with bright lights and noisy generators, the theory being that if Bobby was somewhere in the area and conscious, lights and sounds might lure him back. But the first night passed without any sign of Bobby. No response to calls, no thermal detection by the helicopter, no evidence found by ground teams. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist the moment he entered that line of trees. And as dawn arrived on the second day, bringing renewed light, but also marking 12 hours since his disappearance, the grim reality was setting in. This would not be a quick search with a happy ending. This was something far more serious, far more mysterious, and potentially far more tragic than anyone had expected. Comment below. They did everything right. If you realize that even with a quick response, massive resources and total effort, sometimes the forest simply doesn't give back to those it takes. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because as the second day turned into the third and then the fourth, the search for Bobby Weston evolved from an emergency operation into something much more systematic, broader, and paradoxically more desperate. Because the more resources were mobilized, the more area was covered, the more time passed without any sign, the clearer it became that something profoundly abnormal was happening. And the behind the scenes of a prolonged search and rescue operation reveal as much about human limitations in the face of the vastness of nature as about the extraordinary determination of people who refuse to give up on finding a lost child. On the second full day of searching, Thursday, the operation had grown exponentially. There were now over 200 people involved, including specialized teams brought in from other national parks, local volunteers with experience on Yosemite trails, and even scout groups and mountaineering organizations. That offered assistance. The search area had been expanded to an 8-kilometer radius from ground zero, encompassing approximately 200 square kilometers of territory. To put that into perspective, it's larger than many cities, and most of it covered by forest so dense that visibility is measured in meters, not kilometers. The transformation of the search into a truly massive operation brought a more military structure. The base camp now had command tents, sophisticated communication systems, detailed maps of areas already covered versus areas not yet checked, and coordinators working in shifts to ensure that no area was duplicated or overlooked. Teams were briefed every morning with specific sectors assigned, each sector divided into subsectors in a grid system, each subsector being meticulously searched and then marked as clear when completed. It was an exhausting and agonizingly slow process, but it was the only way to be reasonably sure that no area was being missed. What searching in dense forests truly entails is difficult to fully convey without experiencing it. Each team of 4 to 6 people walks in a line, spaced so that their lines of sight overlap minimally, moving slowly through vegetation that constantly tries to impede progress. They are not just looking at eye level, they are checking under bushes, behind rocks, inside any depression or hole in the ground where a small child might have fallen or hidden. They are listening constantly, frequently, stopping for absolute silence and calling Bobby's name, waiting for any sound of response. They are searching for footprints, for pieces of clothing caught on branches, for any disturbance in the vegetation that might indicate recent passage. The mindset required for this work is particular. You need to maintain hope that the next tree, the next bush, the next ravine will be where you finally find the child. But you also need to mentally prepare yourself for the possibility of finding a body instead of a living child. And you need the resilience to continue, hour after hour, day after day, knowing that your chances of success are statistically low, but that giving up is simply not an option when a child's life is at stake. Many of the volunteers were parents, and the mention that Bobby was 7 years old, the same age as their own children or nephews, made the search intensely personal. By the third day, Friday, the national media had picked up the story. Television cameras were set, up on the edges of the search area, not allowed inside the active operation, but filming from afar, interviewing park rangers, showing photos of Bobby that Tom and Linda had provided. The media coverage brought attention, but also additional pressure. Millions of people were now following the case, waiting for news, hoping for a miracle. And this attention resulted in more resources being made available. The governor of California authorized the use of additional National Guard resources if needed. Specialized teams with cutting-edge technology, including drones equipped with thermal cameras and ground-penetrating radar, were brought in. But then the false alarms began, those moments of brutal hope that proved fruitless. On the third day, the search team found a red t-shirt caught in a bush approximately 5 kilometers north of Ground Zero. The radio burst with activity, people rushing to the location, Tom and Linda being brought in to identify if it was Bobby's t-shirt. But when they arrived, it was clear it wasn't. It was an adult's t-shirt, probably left there by some hiker weeks or months before. The disappointment was devastating, that emotional roller coaster of thinking for brief moments that there was finally progress, only to have hope crushed again. There were also reports of sightings. A family camping in a different area of the park reported seeing a small child alone near their tent on Thursday morning. Teams rushed to that area, which was almost 15 kilometers from where Bobby disappeared, a distance that seemed impossible for a 7-year-old to have covered in 2 days. But when they investigated, they found the child in question, a 6-year-old boy who was camping with his family and had simply wandered away from the tent for a few minutes while his parents prepared breakfast. It wasn't Bobby. Each of these false alarms eroded hope a little more, making it progressively harder to maintain optimism. The impact on the family was visible and devastating. Tom and Linda were practically living at base camp, sleeping perhaps 2 or 3 hours a night in their car, refusing hotel offers in nearby towns because they couldn't bear being so far from where Bobby disappeared. Linda had practically stopped eating altogether. She had to be reminded by concerned volunteers to drink water and take minimal care of herself. Tom had developed tremors in his hands from exhaustion and stress, but he joined search teams whenever they allowed, walking through the forest calling his son's name until he was completely voiceless. The emotional journey they were both going through was unprecedented in their lives. They oscillated between total denial, where at times they convinced themselves that Bobby would simply appear walking through the forest at any moment with a perfectly reasonable explanation for where he had been, and absolute despair, where the likely reality of what had happened hit them with such force that they could barely breathe. They clung to any fragment of hope, any theory about how Bobby could be alive, and simultaneously mentally prepared for the worst, for the possibility that his body would be found, or worse still, that it would never be found. The phenomenon of children getting lost in forests is well documented by search and rescue experts, and understanding these patterns helps explain both the extent of the search and its difficulty. 7-year-old children, when frightened and lost, do not think or act rationally. They don't stay in one place as trained adults know how to do. They wander, often following lines of least resistance that can take them much further than anyone would imagine. There are documented cases of children of this age traveling 10, 15, even 20 kilometers in a state of panic or confusion, distances that seem impossible but are confirmed when they are eventually found. Lost children also frequently don't respond when their names are called, even when they are conscious and can hear. The fear of being in trouble, the shame of being lost, the trauma of what they experienced, all of this can cause them to actively hide instead of seeking help. There are reports of children being found just meters from where search teams had passed hours earlier, simply hiding silently under bushes or behind rocks, mute even when they heard people calling for them. This makes searches exponentially more difficult because you can't trust that a lack of response means the child is absent. On the 4th day, Saturday, the search had reached a scale that was both impressive and soberly indicative of how seriously the case was considered. There were now over 300 people actively searching. They had covered over 300 square kilometers of forest, and yet they had not found a single piece of conclusive evidence of Bobby's whereabouts. There were no clear footprints, no clothes, nothing. It was as if he had simply vanished from the physical plane of existence. And it was at this point, 72 hours after the disappearance, that something happened that would transform the case from a frustrating mystery into something utterly inexplicable and terrifying. Write down, where is he? If you feel that anguish of knowing there's a child somewhere in that vastness, but having no clue where to begin looking. Now I want to delve even deeper into this matter, because what happened on the afternoon of the 4th day, Saturday, August 18, 1998, completely transformed the nature of this tragically fruitless search and rescue operation into something that defies rational explanation and haunts everyone involved to this day. It was approximately 3:15 p.m. when Ranger Sarah Chen and her 5-person search team were working in a dense section of the forest, about 6 kilometers northeast of Ground Zero, and an area that had not yet been covered because it was particularly difficult to access, with steep ravines and almost impenetrable vegetation. The team had just finished their water break and was about to resume when Sarah heard something that made her freeze completely. It was a child's voice, faint but distinctly audible, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest ahead of them, and the voice was saying one word, repeated twice. Bobby, Bobby. It wasn't a scream of panic. It wasn't a call for help. It wasn't crying. It was a call, as if the child were searching for someone, as if he were searching for Bobby, as if she were searching for herself. Sarah would later describe the moment as her brain simply shutting down, unable to process what her ears were clearly registering. Other team members had heard it too, all frozen in their positions, looking at each other with expressions that mixed hope, confusion, and something more primal, something close to visceral fear, because they all knew the name of the child they were looking for. They had all been shouting that name for days, but hearing the name being called back in the voice of a small child coming from the depths of the forest was something that didn't fit into any mental framework they had for understanding the situation. The transformation from paralyzed confusion to action happened in seconds. Sarah shouted into the radio, her voice tense with urgency, mixed with something she herself couldn't name. Team 5, we have possible auditory contact with the child, Sector 9 Delta, moving to investigate. And then the team was running, pushing through dense vegetation in the direction from where the sound had come. But dense forest doesn't allow for easy running. Branches snag on clothing, roots try to knock down. The uneven terrain forces careful movement, even when every instinct screams to move faster. They had managed to advance perhaps 40 meters when the voice came again. Bobby! Bobby! But this time it seemed to come from a slightly different direction, more to the left of where they were moving. Sarah adjusted course, her team following, all now shouting, "Bobby, we're here! Stay where you are!" But there was no response to their shouts. Only silence, and then, perhaps 30 seconds later, again that call, "Bobby, Bobby!" now seeming to come from yet another direction, further away, deeper into the forest. The psychological impact of chasing that voice through the forest for the next 20 minutes was profound for all members of Sarah's team, because the voice kept coming, calling that name periodically, but always seeming to come from a slightly different place, always just out of reach, always moving deeper, further away. And gradually, as they chased, as the logistical impossibility of the situation became clearer, another feeling began to replace the initial hope. It was a feeling that something was wrong, fundamentally wrong, in ways that went beyond simply not being able to reach a frightened child. Other teams in the area had heard Sarah's radio report and were converging on the location, approximately 20 people in total entering that sector of forest from multiple directions. And several of them also began reporting hearing the voice. But there was no consistency in where it seemed to be coming from. To Sarah's team, it seemed to be moving northeast. To the team coming from the east, it seemed to be south. To the team coming from the north, it seemed to be west. It was as if the voice was coming from multiple places simultaneously, or as if it were moving through the forest at a speed that no 7-year-old could keep up with. The mindset of everyone involved was being tested in ways that training simply doesn't prepare you for. Forest rangers are practical people, trained to handle real emergencies with rational responses. But what they were experiencing didn't fit into any category of previous experience. Randy Morrison, a 15-year veteran of search and rescue, would later admit in an interview that for the first time in his career, he felt genuine fear in the forest during the day. Not fear of animals or dangerous terrain, but fear of something he couldn't identify or understand. Tom and Linda had been informed by radio that there had been possible contact and had been taken by a forest ranger to an area on the outskirts of the sector where the voice was being heard. Linda was alternating between sobs of hope and repeating, "It's him, it's my baby, they found my baby." And Tom was tense, his hands clenched into fists so tight that his fingernails were leaving marks on his palms. But as minutes turned into half an hour and the radio reports became progressively more confused and frustrating, that hope began to be eroded by growing confusion and something close to horror, because the voice continued. For more than 2 hours that Saturday afternoon, intermittently, multiple search teams in an area of approximately 3 square kilometers reported hearing the same thing, a small child's voice calling, "Bobby, Bobby," always moving, always out of reach, always impossible to pinpoint precisely. Recorders were turned on, attempting to capture the voice, but the audio quality was poor through dense forest, and subsequent analysis would reveal only ambient noise, mixed with what could be a human voice, or could be a misinterpretation of natural sounds distorted by expectation and desperate hope. That afternoon's journey left deep psychological scars on many of the searchers. Some began to question their own sanity, wondering if they were hearing what they wanted to hear, if the desperation to find Bobby was causing them to interpret natural forest sounds as human voices. Others were absolutely convinced they had heard the child, and that something profoundly strange was happening that they couldn't explain through conventional frameworks. And some began to whisper theories amongst themselves that they would normally never admit aloud in a professional context. The revelations that emerged from these whispered conversations were unsettling. There were those who recalled native legends about forest spirits that mimicked human voices to lure people into deeper exploration. There were discussions about strange acoustic phenomena, about how rock formations and valleys could create bizarre echoes that made sounds seem to come from the wrong directions. There was even mention, in even lower tones, of other cases in other parks where similar things had been reported. Cases that were not widely discussed because no one knew how to classify or explain them. The particular psychological terror of this situation was that there were multiple possible explanations, none entirely satisfactory. If it was Bobby calling his own name, that suggested a level of trauma, confusion, or delirium that was agonizing to imagine a 7-year-old experiencing. If it was a distorted echo of seekers shouting his name being reflected back in strange ways, why did it sound so distinctly like a child's voice rather than an adult's? If it was some natural acoustic phenomenon unrelated to Bobby in any way, the coincidence of it sounding like a child calling that specific name seemed statistically impossible. And if it was something more sinister, if there was a presence in the forest mimicking Bobby's voice for incomprehensible reasons, that opened up possibilities that a scientifically trained mind simply refused to seriously entertain. As evening turned to night, the voice stopped. It simply ceased, the last report coming at 6:47 p.m., and then nothing but the normal silence of the forest. Teams continued searching that area for hours, convinced that Bobby had to be there, that they had been so close. But they found nothing. No physical sign that the child had been in that area. No footprints, no evidence of recent movement through the vegetation, nothing. It was as if the voice had existed without a body, without a physical source, just sound floating through the forest and then disappearing completely. Comment below. The forest spoke. If you feel that something impossible and inexplicable was happening that goes beyond any comfortable rational explanation, now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because after that unsettling afternoon, when multiple people heard the voice calling Bobby's name, investigators, experts, and even members of the search team themselves began to ask the inevitable question: what exactly happened in that forest? And when you explore the possible theories, when you consult experts from multiple fields, when you examine both scientific explanations and those that challenge our conventional understanding, what emerges is a range of possibilities that go from the perfectly rational to the profoundly unsettling. And the honest truth is that to this day, no one has a definitive answer that fully explains what those people experienced. The first and most reassuring theory is that it was all a natural acoustic phenomenon, an auditory illusion created by the unique combination of forest topography, atmospheric conditions, and the seeker's psychological expectations. Dr. Marcus Chen, an environmental acoustic specialist at the University of California, Berkeley, was consulted on the case and offered a technical explanation based on how sound behaves in complex forest environments. He explains that dense forests with irregular topography, ravines, rock formations, and varying layers of vegetation can create conditions where sound behaves in counterintuitive and sometimes completely bizarre ways. Echoes in forests don't work like echoes in caves or simple canyons, where you hear a clear, directional repetition of the original sound. In dense forest, sound is reflected, refracted, and scattered by hundreds of surfaces simultaneously, creating complex interference patterns. The result can be that the original sound becomes unrecognizable, while combinations of partial echoes create a new sound pattern that can sound completely different. Dr. Chen suggests that the search teams, all shouting "Bobby" repeatedly from multiple locations, could have created an acoustic field where echoes of those shouts, combined and distorted by the topography, began to sound like independent voices also calling that name. The human mind under extreme stress also contributes to this theory. When you are desperately searching for someone, when every fiber of your being wants to hear a sign from that person, your brain becomes hypersensitive to any pattern it might interpret as a human voice. This is a well-documented phenomenon called auditory pareidolia, where human brains identify familiar patterns, especially voices and language, in random or ambiguous noise. Wind through trees, distant running water, even the movement of small animals can create sounds that, under the right conditions and with the right mindset, can be interpreted as human speech. But there are aspects of the experience that don't fit neatly into that explanation. Multiple experienced members of the search team, people with years of experience in forests, people who know well how sound behaves in those environments, insist that what they heard was distinctly a child's voice, not a distorted echo of their own adult voices. Some describe that there was a specific quality to the sound, an unmistakable, childlike timbre that could not be merely echoes of adults shouting. And the way the sound seemed to move, appearing from different directions in sequence, suggested a mobile source rather than static echo patterns. The second theory, and perhaps the most agonizing for the family to consider, is that it was indeed Bobby, that he was alive in that area during those hours, but in such a profound state of confusion or delirium that he was calling out his own name. Dr. Rachel Martinez, a psychologist specializing in childhood trauma and responses to extreme survival situations, explains that children lost in hostile environments for days can develop dissociative states where their normal sense of identity becomes fragmented, combined with severe dehydration, exhaustion, possible hypothermia, and absolute terror. A child could enter a state where they are no longer processing reality coherently. In this state, according to Dr. Martinez, it would theoretically be possible for Bobby to be dissociating from himself, possibly dividing his consciousness into a part that is lost and searching, and another part that is calling for the first part. Young children sometimes talk about themselves in the third person when frightened, and in an extreme state, this could manifest as literally calling out his own name, as if searching for someone else. It's an explanation that makes psychological sense, especially considering that Bobby had been lost for over 72 hours at that point, enough time for dehydration and exhaustion to cause severely impaired cognitive function. The impact of this theory on the family was devastating because it suggested that Bobby was alive, but suffering in unimaginable ways, that he was so confused and traumatized that he couldn't even respond appropriately to search teams actively looking for him. But it also offered hope that he was still there, that if they continued searching that specific area intensively, they might find him. And indeed, searches in the area where the voices were heard were dramatically intensified in the following days, with every square meter being repeatedly searched. But nothing was found, no physical sign that Bobby had been there. The third theory was a more technical variation of the first, focusing specifically on how the voices of the search teams themselves might have been distorted. Dr. James Holloway, a geologist familiar with Yosemite and its unique rock formations, pointed out that the specific area where the voices were most frequently heard had particular geological characteristics. There were several small but deep ravines created by erosion over millennia that acted as natural acoustic conduits. Sound produced at one point could be channeled through these ravines and emerge in a completely different location, potentially kilometers away, creating the illusion that the sound was coming from a completely incorrect direction or distance. Furthermore, there were granite formations in the area that could create specific reverberation effects. Granite is extremely dense and reflects sound from different forms of vegetation or soil. The combination of ravines channeling sound and granite surfaces creating reflections could theoretically result in a situation where an adult's voice shouting "Bobby" from a certain location could be transformed through a complex series of reflections and distortions into something that sounded different, emerging from a completely different location. The transformation could even make an adult's voice sound higher pitched, more childlike, especially if lower frequencies were preferentially absorbed by the vegetation while higher frequencies were reflected. But then there were more disturbing theories, ones that investigators were reluctant to discuss publicly, but which could not be completely ruled out. There was a possibility, however remote, of malicious human involvement. Historical cases exist of human predators using recordings of children crying or calling out to lure potential rescuers into ambushes, or to create confusion in search operations. Although there was no specific evidence of criminal activity in Yosemite during that period, the possibility technically existed that someone could have been in the forest with a recording of Bobby's voice obtained from family videos that had been widely distributed through the media, using it for incomprehensible but sinister reasons. There were also, whispered among some of the older members of the search team, references to similar previous cases. Situations where people searching for individuals lost in forests reported hearing voices they couldn't explain, voices that sometimes mimicked the lost person, sometimes called out the names of searchers, always moving, always out of reach. These accounts exist on the fringes of search and rescue literature, rarely discussed officially because they defy rational explanation and because admitting that something inexplicable is happening undermines public confidence in the ability of teams to handle emergencies. David Paulides, the researcher who documented hundreds of strange disappearances in national parks, mentions auditory phenomena in several of his cases. He recounts stories of search teams hearing screams, calls, sometimes even conversations coming from deep within forests. Sounds that, upon investigation, reveal no human source. Paulides is careful not to attribute supernatural causes, but he raises the question of whether there are aspects of these wild environments, perhaps related to magnetic fields, specific geological formations, or factors we simply don't yet understand, that could create anomalous perceptual experiences. The journey through these theories doesn't offer the comfort of a definitive answer, but it does provide a framework for understanding that multiple plausible explanations exist. And the reality may be that no single theory fully captures what happened, that the truth is a combination of natural acoustic factors, the psychological states of seekers under extreme stress, unique characteristics of that specific environment, and possibly elements that we don't yet have adequate scientific knowledge to identify and explain. What is undeniable is that something happened in that forest that profoundly affected everyone who experienced it, something that remains without a fully satisfactory explanation even decades later. Write this down. We don't know everything. If you accept that there are aspects of nature and human experience that still defy our complete understanding. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because we've reached the point where you need to know. What happened to Bobby Weston? Was he found? And the answer, as extraordinary as it is hard to believe, is yes. Bobby was found alive on the 5th day of the search, Sunday, August 19, 1998, at 2:27 p.m. But the circumstances of how and where he was found, the state he was in, and especially what he said about his experience, raise more questions than answers. And for family, for search teams, for anyone trying to understand what really happened, the fact that Bobby survived and returned didn't bring closure. It brought an even deeper mystery. Bobby was found by a volunteer named Marcus Reed, who was searching an area approximately 11 kilometers northeast of where he had disappeared. To put that distance into perspective, 11 kilometers in a straight line through dense forest, crossing ravines, climbing and descending elevations, would be an extremely challenging journey for an experienced adult under ideal conditions. For a 7-year-old child, weighing 22 kilograms, without equipment, without food, without water, crossing that distance in 5 days seemed physically impossible. And even more impossible was the fact that the area where Bobby was found was in the opposite direction from where the voices had been heard just a day before. The transformation from a moment of triumphant discovery to profound confusion happened quickly. Marcus first saw something red among the trees, that bright red t-shirt that had been described in every alert. He ran towards it, shouting into the radio, and found Bobby sitting against a large tree trunk, awake, but seemingly in a stupor. The child was visibly thin, dehydrated, his skin pale and lips cracked. But he was conscious, his eyes open, and when Marcus knelt beside him and said, "Bobby? Are you Bobby Weston?" the boy nodded weakly. The emotional impact of that moment was intense for everyone involved. Marcus would later admit that he cried openly, that he had to force himself to maintain enough professional composure to assess Bobby's medical condition while simultaneously radioing that the child had been found alive. The explosion of relief and joy that swept through base camp when the news arrived was indescribable. Tom and Linda, who had spent 5 days in the private hell of not knowing whether their son was alive or dead, collapsed into each other's arms, sobbing with relief, so intense it was almost physically painful. A medical helicopter was dispatched immediately, and Bobby was evacuated to the hospital less than 40 minutes after being found. Initial medical assessment showed that he was severely dehydrated, had lost approximately 3 kilograms of body weight, was suffering from mild hypothermia, and had multiple abrasions and bruises on his legs and arms. But miraculously, he had no serious injuries. He had no broken bones, no signs of animal attack, and no severe hypothermia that could cause permanent damage. Doctors described his condition as surprisingly good, considering he had been lost in the woods for 5 days with only the clothes he was wearing and no access to food or water. But it was when Bobby began to speak, when doctors, psychologists, and eventually his parents tried to understand what had happened to him during those 5 days, that the case changed from a story of miraculous survival to something far more perplexing. Bobby had fragmented and often contradictory memories of his experience. He remembered entering the trees, following what he described as the lady, a woman he said he saw at the edge of the clearing who seemed to be beckoning him to come. When asked about the woman's description, Bobby was vague, saying only that she seemed nice and that he felt he should follow her. The mindset of a 7-year-old trying to process traumatic experience makes testimonies inherently challenging to interpret. Child. Psychologist Dr. Stephen Walsh, who conducted multiple sessions with Bobby in the weeks following the rescue, explains that it's common for children to create narratives to explain events they don't fully understand, especially traumatic events. The lady Bobby described could have been a child's interpretation of multiple things: a shadow through the trees that appeared to have a human shape, an animal he briefly saw, or even a complete construct of his mind trying to make sense of the inexplicable impulse that led him into the forest. Bobby had little coherent memory of the first few days after he disappeared. He remembered being scared, trying to find his way back, but not recognizing anything around him. He remembered hearing people calling his name but being too afraid to answer. Although when pressed about why he was scared, he couldn't articulate a clear reason. He said he tried to blow the whistle he had on the cord around his neck, but found that the whistle had disappeared, although the cord was still there. The whistle was never found, and how it disappeared from the cord remains unexplained. Bobby's journey through the forest, as far as he could describe, seemed random and disoriented. He had no sense of direction or purpose. He just kept walking because standing still seemed more frightening. He remembered crossing a stream at some point, but he didn't drink the water because his parents had taught him that water on trails needed to be treated before drinking. This decision likely saved him from waterborne illnesses, but it also meant he suffered severe dehydration. He found some berries he recognized from illustrations in one of his nature books and ate a small amount, but he was too afraid to eat things he didn't know, so he spent most of the 5 days without substantial food. But the most disturbing and relevant aspect of Bobby's testimony was about the voices. When asked if he had heard people calling his name during the time he was lost, Bobby said yes, that he heard it all the time. But then he added something that made everyone in the room freeze. "And I would call back. I kept yelling, 'Bobby, Bobby,' so they would find me." When Dr. Walsh asked him to elaborate, Bobby explained that he thought if he yelled his own name, people would know where he was and come get him. It was 7-year-old logic, strange but not entirely irrational when you consider how a young child processes an emergency situation. But that still didn't fully explain what the search teams had heard, because Bobby was found 11 kilometers east-northeast of the starting point, but the voices had been heard concentrated in an area 6 kilometers to the northeast, a completely different area. Unless Bobby had traveled through that area a day before continuing to move and eventually ending up where he was found, which was possible, but would create a strange and tortuous line of movement through the forest. And even accepting that, Bobby's description of shouting his own name didn't fully capture the strangeness of what the searchers had experienced. That sensation of voices coming from multiple directions, moving in ways that seemed impossible. There was also a significant period of time that Bobby simply couldn't remember. He had fragments of memory from the first few days and the last day, but there was a gap of approximately 48 hours where he had no clear recollection of where he was or what he was doing. Dr. Walsh explained that this could be the result of trauma, severe dehydration affecting brain function, or even a psychological protection mechanism where Bobby's mind simply blocked out the most terrible period of his experience. Attempts to recover these memories through therapy were carefully abandoned when it became clear that pressing was causing Bobby significant distress without producing reliable information. The lasting impact on the family was complex. There was immense gratitude at having Bobby back alive, that the nightmare had ended positively when so many similar cases end tragically. But there was also persistent trauma for everyone involved. Bobby developed a fear of forests that lasted for years, refusing to leave the house if there were many trees around, having frequent nightmares about being lost. Tom and Linda dealt with deep guilt, despite all the experts assuring them that they had done nothing wrong, that what happened was impossible to predict or prevent. And there were unanswered questions that haunted them. That feeling that even with Bobby back, they didn't fully understand what had happened, what he had experienced, what had led to that disappearance unfolding the way it did. The official search ended the day Bobby was found, with celebrations tempered by the exhaustion of the teams, that had worked non-stop for 5 days. But for many involved, especially those who heard the voices that Saturday afternoon, the case never truly closed. There was always that lingering question: what did they really hear? Was it Bobby delirious and calling his own name? Was it a bizarre natural acoustic phenomenon so defying probability? Or was it something we simply cannot explain with our current understanding of how the world works? Comment below. Survived but changed. If you realize that even when there's a happy ending, experiences like this leave permanent marks on everyone involved. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because the case of Bobby Weston doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of a much larger and deeply unsettling pattern of disappearances in US national parks that share such specific and bizarre characteristics that they defy coincidental explanation. And when you begin to examine this pattern through the meticulous work of researchers like David Paulides, when you see how many similar cases exist, when you realize the impossible similarities between events separated by decades and thousands of kilometers, you are forced to confront the possibility that something is happening in these wild environments that we don't fully understand. Something that goes beyond people simply getting lost in normal and predictable ways. David Paulides, a former detective and investigator, dedicated more than a decade to documenting these cases in his Missing 411 series, which now includes multiple books and documentaries detailing hundreds of disappearances that share specific and disturbing characteristics. Paulides began this research after being approached by forest rangers who confidentially expressed concern about the number and nature of disappearances they had witnessed or investigated throughout their careers. Cases that didn't fit normal patterns of people getting lost, cases where elements simply didn't make logical sense, cases that haunted them years later. The transformation from initial skepticism to recognition that a real pattern exists happened for Paulides as he compiled data from hundreds of cases, and the patterns that emerged are too specific to be easily dismissed as coincidence. Young children, often between 2 and 10 years old, disappearing in seconds, even when under adult supervision. These children being found, when they are found, at distances that seem physically impossible for them to have traveled in the available time. Bobby traveling 11 kilometers through brutal terrain in 5 days fits perfectly into this pattern. Although there are certainly even more extreme documented cases, there is a case of a 3-year-old child who disappeared in a national park and was found 19 kilometers away, crossing terrain that included a river that an adult would have difficulty fording and elevations that would require technical climbing. When found, the child was relatively unharmed. Their clothes were clean instead of dirty, as would be expected after such an arduous journey, and they could not or did not want to explain how they had gotten there. There is also the case of a 7-year-old boy in Montana who disappeared from a campsite and was found days later 15 kilometers away on a mountaintop at an altitude of over 3,000 meters, saying only that the friendly big bear had helped him, a description that was never satisfactorily explained. The impact of these patterns is profound when you recognize how many cases there are. Paulides identified that disappearances frequently occur near bodies of water or granite rock formations, exactly like Bobby, who disappeared in an area with both. There is a pattern of weather conditions changing dramatically soon after disappearances, with sudden storms hindering searches in ways that seem almost deliberately mistimed. And there are those strange acoustic phenomena, inexplicable voices, sounds that don't make sense, reported in multiple cases by credible and experienced search teams. In a case in Great Smoky Mountains National Park in 2006, search teams looking for a missing 6-year-old girl reported hearing childlike laughter coming from deep in the forest, constantly moving, always out of reach, for 2 days. The girl was eventually found alive but had no memory of laughing or much of what happened during the 3 days she was lost. In a case in Glacier National Park in 1999, searchers heard what they described as conversation coming from a dense area of the forest, sounding like multiple voices speaking in a language they couldn't identify. When they investigated, there was no one there. The mindset required to handle these cases creates particular tension for search and rescue professionals. They are trained to operate within rational and scientific frameworks, to explain events through understandable causes. But when repeatedly confronted with situations that challenge these explanations, when they see patterns that shouldn't exist if everything were just random bad, luck or normal human error, it creates profound cognitive dissonance. Many veteran forest rangers, upon retirement, eventually speak publicly about cases that disturb them, about things they witnessed or experienced that they simply cannot explain through conventional means. There is also a disturbing pattern of tracking dogs failing to establish trails in a significant number of these cases. In normal searches, well-trained dogs have a very high success rate in detecting and following human scent. But in many of these missing 411 pattern cases, including Bobby's case, dogs fail to pick up a trail or inexplicably lose it after a short distance. This happens even in conditions that should be ideal for tracking, suggesting that there is something unusual about these situations that interferes with the dog's normal ability to detect human scent. The journey through these cases reveals that national parks, for all their managed beauty and appearance of controlled security, remain fundamentally wild in ways we don't fully appreciate. There are 3,000 square kilometers in Yosemite alone, multiplied by dozens of national parks and hundreds of national forests, resulting in vast stretches of territory where human presence and understanding are minimal. In these areas, there may be natural phenomena, geological, magnetic, acoustic, or of types we haven't yet identified, that affect human beings in ways we don't foresee. There may even be aspects of human consciousness, perception, and spatial navigation that function differently in certain environments than in the urban or suburban contexts to which we are accustomed. But beyond speculating on ultimate causes, there are urgent practical lessons that cases like Bobby's teach us. The speed at which a child can disappear cannot be underestimated. Literally 2 or 3 seconds of distraction, and a child who was within earshot is no longer visible or audible. The mindset needed when taking children into wilderness environments must be one of constant vigilance, not casual relaxation. Young children should never be alone, even for moments, even in areas that seem safe and open. Because, as Bobby demonstrated, the line between open area and impenetrable forest can be crossed in 2 steps. Proper equipment is crucial but not sufficient. Bobby had a whistle that mysteriously disappeared. But even without that anomaly, whistles have limited range in dense forest. Modern technologies like small GPS trackers that children can wear are an investment that can literally save lives. Brightly colored and visible clothing is essential. And perhaps most importantly, children need to be taught what to do if they get separated. Stay put, make noise constantly, and not hide from people searching even if they are scared. The lasting impact of Bobby's case, and hundreds like his, should be transformative in how we view and respect wild environments. They are not just pretty backdrops for selfies and casual recreation. They are complex ecosystems with real dangers, where humans are visitors who need to operate with caution and preparation. The hidden truths about what can happen in these places, about patterns of disappearances that defy easy explanation, should not terrify us to the point of avoiding nature altogether, but they should humble us, make us recognize that there is much we do not understand, and motivate us to take serious precautions when venturing into these areas. And perhaps, more profoundly, cases like Bobby's remind us what real mysteries still exist in the world. That not everything is explainable or understandable through current frameworks, that nature holds secrets it may never fully reveal, and that sometimes, when a child disappears among the trees and is heard days later calling their own name, we don't have a completely satisfactory answer to what happened. Only deep gratitude when they return, and a resolution to learn what we can from their experiences to protect others in the future. Write this down. The forest teaches, if you understand that wild places deserve deep respect and that there are lessons in each of these cases that we should take seriously. If you've made it this far, to this final moment with me, it's because you understand that stories like Bobby's aren't just about unsolved mysteries. They're about the limits of our understanding, about how nature still holds secrets that defy our explanation, and especially about how we need to respect and prepare ourselves when entering these wild spaces. And that matters much more than you might imagine, especially if you or someone you love visits national parks. If this type of content resonates with you, if you value investigations that explore not only what happened but why, that treat real cases with the seriousness and respect that the victims and their families deserve, subscribe to the channel. Because every week we delve into disappearances in national parks that rarely receive the attention they should, cases that are part of larger patterns that need to be understood. You are part of this community of people who want real answers, who don't accept simply filing away mysteries without trying to fully understand them. Leave a comment now saying, "Bobby is back but changed." These 4 words show that you've been on this entire journey with me, that you've reflected on how experiences like this permanently transform everyone involved, and that you understand the complexity of these cases that go far beyond simple stories of people getting lost in the forest. If Bobby's story touched you in any way, if you felt that connection to the mystery of the voices calling his name, if you now see national parks with renewed respect for the real dangers they may hide, leave a like. It's your way of saying that content like this, which investigates unsettling patterns in depth and without sensationalism, deserves to exist and reach more people who plan to visit these places. And look, there's a video over there about another case. Click and continue watching. You have much more to discover about these mysteries that nature holds. Thank you for being here, for investing this time, for taking these warnings seriously. Warnings that can literally save lives. And if you visit a national park, remember, Bobby, keep your children in sight at all times and respect the forest for what it truly is, beautiful but wild in ways we don't yet fully understand. We'll meet again at the next mystery.